When I was a boy, I used to love to watch the show In Search of. It was a television series that broadcast weekly from 1977 to 1982, and it was devoted to mysterious phenomena. Now, the program conducted investigations into the controversial and sometimes the paranormal, things like UFOs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. But it also featured episodes about mysterious historical events and personalities, or missing persons or ships, like Amelia Earhart and the Titanic. No, they hadn't found it yet. Now, Leonard Nimoy, also known as Spock on Star Trek, was the host and the narrator. And I can remember getting so excited at the beginning of each episode, but then being absolutely terrified by the end. Well, we all love a good story, don't we? Especially if there is a mystery involved or an element of the unknown attached to it. Now, this evening I'd like to share with you an amazing story that has all of these elements and more. Because it begins with an astonishing sign that came from the heavens. And it has mystery, intrigue, and suspense, and it involves darkness and deceit, and even tragically, death. It's about a group of individuals who are on a quest in search of a Savior. Now, chances are that you have a Bible somewhere handy. So I encourage you to go ahead and grab it and be turning to Matthew chapter 2. And just leave it open to Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. Let's look at the details of this astonishing story together. It begins in Bethlehem of Judea with the birth of Jesus. Now, Bethlehem of Judea was just 6 miles south of Jerusalem, a little-known town with a large history, because it was there that Jacob buried Rachel and set up a pillar of memory beside her grave, Genesis 35. And it was there that Ruth lived when she married Boaz in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. But above all, it was the home and the city of David, through whom the promised Messiah, the King of the Jews, would come. And so it was here that the Jews expected God's anointed one to arrive. Because in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 it says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. And his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity." But the story quickly carries us to the Far East, where we meet the Magi. Now, who were these wise men as we have come to know them? Not to be confused with men like Simon the sorcerer from Acts chapter 8, or Elymas the magician in Acts 13. But the Magi from the east were more akin to Daniel and the great counselors of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian kings. And these men were noted for their knowledge and their keen perception. They were skilled in philosophy and medicine and the natural sciences. They were great observers of nature and were in tune with the rhythm and order of creation. But they were also serious students of the stars, astrologers, who believed that a man could determine his entire destiny by the star under which he was born. Most importantly, these men were Gentiles from afar. And while they may have been familiar with the writings of Daniel and perhaps even Jeremiah. At least they were aware of the Jewish hope for Messiah. Now, the distance from which they had traveled was vast, geographically and culturally, but especially religiously, as they have left the land of the pagan and the barbarian and the heathen in search of the one true God of heaven and earth. Because despite all of these barriers and more, we find them in Jerusalem making the greatest of all inquiries in Matthew 2, verse 2. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Now, when they first arrived in Jerusalem, where the throne of David was, one wonders, were they surprised to find that the city was not just bursting with excitement at the arrival of its king? Were they a little confused to find instead a pompous pretender perched high in his pretentious palace? Well, nevertheless, our story has carried us into the holy city, Jerusalem, the heart of Judaism, where they met with Herod. Now, there are several Herods mentioned in the New Testament, but this was Herod the First, also called Herod the Great, who reigned from about BC 40 to BC 4. And he was not an Israelite. He was of Idumean descent, an Edomite. And so, unlike Jesus, Herod was not born a king, but he usurped the throne by political maneuvering and treachery and violence. And he held his power with tyranny and with terror, even murdering his own relatives. In fact, even Caesar Augustus once quipped, "It's safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son." And so it's no wonder that all of Jerusalem was troubled, along with Herod, at the arrival of these strange men from the east in Matthew 2 and verse 3. Because Herod feared a grand Jewish movement in favor of a royal Messiah. And Jerusalem, well, they feared Herod. And so in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 4, Herod holds a summit to discover where the king was born. Now, what do we know about these religious leaders? The chief priests were a collection of ranking religious families who variously ruled as high priests. And the scribes were the professional students of the law of Moses, also identified as the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But Herod sought a definite answer from an authoritative source, to which these religious rulers rightly appealed to the scriptures, in particular Micah chapter 5 verse 2. Now, having learned of the place, Herod also discerned the time of birth through a secret meeting with the Magi in Matthew 2 and verse 7. And Herod pretended to have the same religious interests as these Magi. But later in the text, in chapter 2 and verse 16, it reveals that, well, he had a much darker motive. Now, immediately, having learned of the prophecy of Micah, the Magi depart for Bethlehem of Judea. And the road to Bethlehem really is an easy 2-hour walk. But in Matthew 2 and verse 10, we find them joyfully being guided by this most curious star. All the way to Bethlehem. And what they find there is a simple home. And there is the King of the Jews, the Savior of the world. And it was perhaps not what they expected. Because, well, there were no outward signs of royalty, but their faith, if you will, did not falter. And in Matthew 2, verse 11, they worshiped the child. Because true worship always involves reverent humility. And their humble action must have begun in the heart. There was no one there to impress, and there was no reward for their journey, and there was no threat upon their lives. Truly, their hearts must have beheld what their eyes did not see. And true worship always involves sacrificial offerings, because they will often give of their means, those who first have given of their hearts. And their gifts were costly. Gold is a gift fit for a king, and frankincense is the gift of a priest fit for God himself. And myrrh, well, that's the gift for those who are close to death. And so, having achieved their goal and being warned by God in a dream, they departed by another way. Now, there are three classes of searchers in this story. Because there was, of course, the Magi, who were in search of a sovereign Savior to serve. And their journey began with this mysterious star, which led them to the sovereign scriptures, which resulted in true worship from the heart. And they came from afar, eager to cross all of those boundaries, geographical boundaries, cultural boundaries, and especially religious boundaries. And they came prepared for worship. When they found him, their offerings were rich because they came from the heart. Now, what about us? Are we as willing as they were to overcome the barriers which might impede our own service of the Christ? And are we as prepared as they were for worship? There was also Herod, who was in search of a way to secure his sovereignty in order to serve himself. He was troubled by the Christ, because Christ is a threat to the self. And Herod resorted to underhanded hostility, believing that he would somehow preserve himself. But in the end, he lost everything. He lost his life, his reign, and even perhaps his soul. And for what? Many are like this even today, because Christ demands that we surrender to him as we deny ourselves. Many today, they hate him for that. And so many today are still hostile towards Christ. But what about us? Are we truly living for the Lord, or are we serving ourselves? There were also those chief priests and scribes who were in search of a way to save their social status. You might recall how later in the Gospels, in John chapter 12, verse 42 and 43, that many of the rulers believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. This child in Bethlehem posed no threat to them. Look at the circumstances of his birth. Born basically out of wedlock to a poor carpenter in a barn in Bethlehem. But they were blinded by their own false expectations. And though they knew the scriptures, they had a calloused indifference towards them because, they did not fit their own preconceived notions. Now, what about us? Are we so familiar with the Scriptures that we have developed a casual indifference towards them? Do we know the plain teachings of Jesus, but lack the will to put them into practice because we might be required to become an enemy of the world in order to become a friend of Christ? You know, people are in search of many things. Some search for fame, some search for fortune, many search for happiness. What are you searching for? You know, God has made us some powerful promises that if we seek Him out, that we will find Him. From Old Testament to New. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29, we're told that you will find Him if you search for Him with all your heart and all your soul. And listen to the wise counsel that was given to King Asa when Azariah says to him in 2 Chronicles 15, 1 and 2. He said, "The Lord is with you when you are with Him, and if you seek Him, He will let you find Him." But what type of seeker are you? Are you as wise as these magi, willing to come from afar, prepared to humbly bow, ready to give Him the best of your gifts? Or are you like Herod, striving to secure the self, and in the end, losing everything? Or are you like those religious rulers, familiar with the divine principles that are intended to guide, yet unwilling to surrender to them because of a casual indifference? Now, won't you join me right here each week on Wednesday evening while we go on a quest together in order to discover the real Jesus of the Gospels by examining His teachings, by observing His miracles, and by immersing ourselves in the intimate encounters that He had with all sorts of people who were just like ourselves. And so, join me right here each week on Wednesday evenings as together we go in search of a Savior.